Yeah, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, and many thanks for joining the session from the data science, well, from the Humanitarian Data Science and Ethics team. So today we're going to run through a bit about the project that we've developed. This being a specifically humanitarian tool, but linking with Branca and the AI for Peace team, we definitely saw a kind of transferability to other sectors, and we're just going to walk you through the tool, our experiences today, and how people may be engaged in can become better engaged in how to ethically apply AI for their own projects. Technical issue already. There we go. So quickly, who's speaking today? So my name Rob Trigwell. I work for the United Nations International Organization for Migration, and the team there also established the Humanitarian Data Science and Ethics Group, and that's really kind of like the team speaking today. And I'll pass over to my colleague Prithvi to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about the decision tree. So as Rob mentioned, I also work with him at the UN Migration Agency, as well as the Data Science and Ethics Group. Yeah, I'll let Rob continue.
Grand. So, so a little bit of background, basically. So IOM's DTM, so the Displacement Tracking Matrix, is a data collection tool of one of the big United Nations agencies. Most big humanitarian organizations, whether United Nations or whether it's NGOs, have similar teams, similar departments, and a lot of it is about collecting primary data or the processing of secondary data to support humanitarian analysis. So basically, over the last 10 years, there's been a bit of a data explosion in the sector. There's greater capacity to collect data. There's more agencies collecting data, but there's also, importantly, more emphasis on interoperability, on structuring. So now there's common structuring languages, and there's been a big push to make a lot of the data kind of open. So these are all massive progressions for the sector. It helps us to share data better. It helps us to be more accountable. It helps just better analysis. But also with all of those progressions comes heightened risks as well. So how is our data being used? How is our data being used in models? How our data is being combined with other data sets to maybe identifying kind of sensitivities that when independently you're looking at kind of non-sensitive data, but non-sensitive data when mosaic together with other data sets can become quite kind of sensitive. So we're not the only stakeholder in this discussion. So with these problems of concern. So in 2018, we as IOM, we established a group called the Data Science and Ethics Group, or the Humanitarian Data Science and Ethics Group, DSEG. DSEG has a much better acronym than HDSEG. So, and basically the idea is that it was humanitarian practitioners, data scientists, academic researchers, and ethic advocates. And the idea was that basically we'd create a multidisciplinary voice of kind of on the academic side, but also on the humanitarian practitioner side. And we see there's enough theoretical and academic discussions about the ethics of AI. So we really, from agencies that manage displacement camps, or agencies that distribute NFI non-food items or food items, or do cash transfers. The emphasis on really the practical and applicability of it. So we see our work as kind of the cover of a multiple different junctures. So we see it as it's a data responsibility discussion, obviously, the AI ethics, humanitarian innovation, and also humanitarian principles and standards. And the 4 circles in the bigger circle is kind of what we see as our kind of, not mandate, but our cover of work, and they will form the foundation they'll form the foundation for the tool that we'll get onto in just a second. So firstly, when the group originally got together, we did a big mapping of what, when it comes to the application of data science in humanitarian operations, what were the biggest opportunities, what were the biggest concerns, what were the biggest gaps. So we did a bit of a mapping exercise throughout the first 6 months of the group's establishment, and there was about 30 different things that come up, but there was 5 points that kept on recurring, and this was peer review, or the lack of. So unlike the academic sector, humanitarians working in models work independently. We work in silos, work within our own teams. So there was a distinct lack of peer review. Accountability, is it the data science, the data scientist within UN organization A or NGO B that is accountable if the model is correct or if it's not? Is it the program manager that pushed this aspect of the project? Is it the donor funding it? Communication, we work with very vulnerable populations. We work with people that are being forcibly displaced from their homes, refugees, migrants. If we're using certain data science methods to allocate where aid should go, or maybe where we should pre-position stock, how do we communicate that process, in a technical sense, but also in a language sense? We could be working with communities that English or French could be their 3rd or 4th language. Inclusivity, how do we include people in the process, not just the data scientists, but people in the supply chain, the donors, people in writing the reports, or even the project development. And transparency, how do we make this entire process transparent? At the end of the day, we're trying to apply AI and data science for good, and in order to build trust, we have to be transparent. So these were the key things. So this led to the development of the ethical framework, which is this document on the left-hand side, and I'll ask my colleague Prithvi to paste the link in the chat. And this was originally looking, so we originally started the discussion at peer review for technical to technical, but then a few of the data scientists in the discussion were like, look, we can make a model that can maybe predict movement from country A to country B, but if the implications of those results mean the border closures, then that's a bigger consideration than what maybe one of the technical data scientists should have. There's the ethical considerations, and then there's also the practical considerations. So I have a background in aid, so would this system be applicable in this circumstance? It could be a chatbot for some sort of psychosocial support. Would that be applicable in a certain context? Sometimes AI would be applicable, sometimes it just wouldn't be applicable. So we developed this framework to consider ethical, practical, and technical considerations of this discussion. We deliberately left out the legal aspect because of just, this isn't a tool just for, for country A or for Europe. It's for worldwide. So if we tried to tackle in legal considerations, it would never have got to fruition. So this was the development of the framework, and this was the kind of the key steps of the consideration. So it's the fundamentals. So this goes back to the circles that we presented, and this was before we start to talk about any AI project, but really any project in general. Is are we aware of the humanitarian principles and ethics? Do no harm. Are we reducing vulnerability to the populations we're supporting? The key principles that make our work by definition humanitarian: AI ethics, data responsibilities, human rights, and risk mitigation. And we deliberately put this step as stage 0 because we don't actually see it as a step in the process. We see it as basically the foundation. Like, you need to know this before you even engage in step 1. On that note, step number 1 is problem recognition. So basically having a full kind of holistic understanding of actually what is the problem at hand. We see so many times that people come to us with a app or a product without where it's product first and problem second. So, you know, it's trying to put a square peg in a round hole. So, you know, what's the problem at hand? Okay, we're trying to get an understanding of the number of migrants crossing across the Horn of Africa, or we're trying to better target vulnerable households in Lebanon for cash grants. You know, that's the problem. And then, okay, once we have a thorough understanding of the problem, what are the potential solutions that we can implement? For example, can we lean on call detail records to get mobility trends, and that might work in areas of high mobile phone ownership, but, you know, in areas of northwest Myanmar where mobile phone ownership is very low or connectivity is low, that particular solution wouldn't be appropriate for the problem. So the kind of the first step, but the second step on the is really having a thorough understanding of the problem, and then, is AI in this circumstance applicable for said problem? And then the framework then goes into much more kind of technical aspects of an AI project. So number 2, number 3, and number 4, so the data journey, the algorithm check, and the reliance on outputs. But really, any humanitarian project should have the fundamentals in place, and it should have the problem and the solution. So on that note, we developed this 50-page framework, but we're like, you know, we design this for practitioners working in South Sudan. I'm in Ethiopia right now, Venezuela, you know, not everybody dealing with kind of waves of displacement or, you know, big refugee resettlement programs have the time to really get into the nuts and bolts of a 50-page kind of AI ethics document. So we designed a tool called the decision tree, and it's an online tool, and it's designed for project teams thinking about developing an AI project for humanitarian outcomes. And if you can see here, the 5 steps, well, we've actually separated problem to search for solutions as 2 independent steps, and we've kind of, so there's actually 6 steps, but in the color coded, there's the 5 steps, because fundamentals is basically for everyone. So what we've done is that basically you can enter the decision tree, and maybe you've got a real thorough understanding of the problem, and you've identified AI. So maybe, you know, you're trying to understand the population of refugee camps in an inaccessible area of Syria. So you know the problem. We don't know how many people are displaced. You know that maybe from automatic shelter detection using in remote sensing imagery, you know there's a real tested and proven solution. So maybe you'd enter the tool that the data checks, you know, do we have the data in place to do that? Or maybe you're just curious about, you know, maybe you're an AI enthusiast, but, you know, you don't really come from a humanitarian background. So, you know, you might go in at the very beginning of the problem recognition stage, but anyone, and then, so you can enter the tool at the various different stages, but then it brings everyone down to the fundamentals, and then it kind of pings you back into the tool based on the stage that you clicked at. So so basically this is the schematic of the tool, and I'll go into this in just a second. And through about a 12-month process, we identified around 67 steps that we put into order. But this isn't us saying this is the order. This is us saying we've, as a network, have thought about some of the main considerations you need to have when developing an AI project for humanitarian operations. So there's the, and I'll go into this in much more step, but you kind of see a process. So everyone can go through the tree in a different journey. But basically it's like, you know, are you familiar with, you know, humanitarian principles, yes or no? And if you're not, then, you know, it will take you to a page where you can be inducted into that. But if you are, you can skip along. And then you kind of, you follow the process of the previous slide, where you essentially just get to the end. So, you know, problem recognition, you know, this is the bit where we're really trying to avoid the techno-solutionism. But, you know, so, you know, do we know the problem? Great. Because if you don't know the problem, there's no point thinking about, you know, data quality if you haven't even really got an idea of the problem. So it's kind of like a sequential process. And we've only got one red flag where we're basically saying you shouldn't do this. And that's basically like, is AI, it's just down here, is AI applicable for this context? And if it's not, then maybe you should have a rethink. But the idea is to basically be like a facilitator rather than a roadblock, but really get to people critically think. So I'm just gonna change my screens now to this slide. And Prithvi, if you could just give me a shout if you can see the slide.
Yeah, it's good.
So this is basically the decision tree. But so the previous slide was kind of the network, but you don't see that when you're going through it. So we'll share the link, but basically you can log on and you'll see that the main steps here. And okay, first thing you do is fundamentals. So you would kind of go through the key aspects of the fundamentals before you even really start to go through the decision process. Let's just say, yeah, I'm really up to speed with the ethics of AI, so I know information, but maybe my knowledge about humanitarian principles is a bit rusty, so remind me again. And then here, you kind of, you get a bit of an induction, you get key links to humanitarian standards, code of conducts, core humanitarian standards, all of kind of things that humanitarians need to know to be humanitarian. And then data management, yeah, let's just say I'm good at data management. No, I don't really know about human rights. And again, it shows a load of collated information about the key aspects of human rights. And here, everything we do is collated, and we're not drafting this from scratch. We're really just presenting key documents and key tools as part of an AI humanitarian project. So here we quote the human rights in the age of artificial intelligence documents. So you can kind of go through and risk mitigation. Let's just say, yeah, I'm up to speed with this, and with this stage is complete. And then we kind of go into problem recognition. Like, do we know the problem? Let's just say we the key aspects to make you think about a problem. And here we've cited a lot of kind of innovation guides, from data innovation for development, from ideas to proof of concepts, just some of the key things we need to think about. So anyway, I'm gonna go, we'll share that links if people want to play around with it after the presentation. But this is but basically if I had kept on clicking, then obviously different people with different backgrounds and different areas of expertise may skim over some areas or go into deep dive in other areas. Anyway, and Prithvi, I'll now pass the floor to you to go into these sections.
Thank you so much, Rob. So, as Rob was showing you, the decision tree works in these across and takes you like in this journey and across these different stages. So assuming that, you've passed your fundamentals check and you've come to, you've also passed your problem recognition and the suitability of data science, you've been through these stages. And then what we want to kind of zoom in on today, especially when we're talking about, responsible, ethical, but also very inclusive AI, the question of data is immediately tied to this very closely and centrally. And from that point of view, what we want to talk about today in terms of like a deep dive into one sort of aspect of the decision tree is very much how data has a strong influence when you think about ethical AI. And particularly stage 3 is very important in emphasizing that, because it tries to look at data that is collected, but also data that is subsequently analyzed. And if we go to the next slide, so this ultimately ties very closely to what we think is really important in terms of understanding and also mitigating bias. And what we've tried to place a very strong emphasis on bias here, because it's one of the areas with the biggest potential for harm. And I think when it comes to the question of harm, of course, this is especially amplified in the case of humanitarian data science or humanitarian projects more generally. But the potential for harm, especially what we see very in recent AI projects, also in terms of all the negative press when it comes to questions around bias and things like that, it's an emerging question. So I think it can't be kind of stressed enough. And we use this stage to kind of inform the users about the different forms of a bias that may be present within the data and how that may kind of manifest itself as a result of the process that you go through. And then if you go to the next slide, yeah, so one of the things that we also think is very important in terms of, again, understanding and ensuring that the use of data science is ethical, responsible, and also inclusive is recognizing that this inherent bias may exist, but what may be the best ways for mitigating it. And one of the things that we again stress here is the notion of diversity, but diversity here, what we mean by is understanding the very strong relationship between data and representation, and how the questions and issues of bias that may arise would be in relation to this tension. So when we think about, you know, the data in this data check stage, we also think about it more from the point of view of how, you know, not just the incompleteness or the bias nature of the data itself, but also subsequently how is this data analyzed and processed, and what would its larger implications be. And from that point of view, we think that, you know, diversity, not just in terms of individuals who are part of these projects, and, you know, even in humanitarian projects, that we'd like to ensure that, you know, teams that work together, the very nature of this decision tree being interactive, being iterative, you know, at every stage you can go back, you can go forward, or, you know, the fact that it like signposts you through two different resources is very much in the kind of flavor or emphasis on like learning together. So in this sense, when we say diversity, we also want to place a lot of emphasis on multiple subjectivities, knowledge communities that may be analyzing the data, so that we can help mitigate unexpected consequences of the project. And also particularly in the humanitarian sector, improve accountability and questions of exclusion. And then finally, we also talk about, you know, the subsequent stage where this all kind of comes together more from a very technical point of view. Although I'm not the technical expert on our team, what we have also placed emphasis on bias here, because it's one of the areas that, you know, we think is very, very important for the overall output. And we've also signposted to some tools that we think are very, you know, again, reflecting of this interactive and learning aspect of the decision tree to help you think about it a bit more. And ultimately, the algorithm check is kind of designed to help you better understand how the statistical assumptions of your model may affect the outcomes of, you know, from the data responsibility perspective, and more from like a bias perspective. So again, like thinking about this whole process and the decision tree very holistically, when it comes to even, you know, the diversity of teams, you also need a diversity of experts. You also need, you know, the different blocks that kind of come together and look at this process from beginning to end, but, you know, in kind of these different stages, which also help you to ensure that at every stage, different experts and different individuals have looked at the possible questions and potentials for harm. I'll stop there, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Prithvi. So, so basically, yeah, just to go back to kind of this schematic here, we're just trying to emphasize that, you know, in any kind of data science project, but we're speaking uniquely to the kind of humanitarian sector, because that's our specialism and that's the sector we're part of. You know, it's a real complex project, particularly, you know, when you're working with the vulnerable populations that we are. You know, it's not just the kind of the considerations with kind of models and errors that we need to consider. It's like, you know, it's the exposures to particular vulnerabilities. For example, the example I mentioned earlier about, you know, forecasting and movement predictions become a very popular topic in the sector. But by identifying migration flows, to high accuracy, that can for sure have great, humanitarian outcomes. It can identify areas where maybe we need to build humanitarian corridors and pre-position stock and work with, local actors and support migrant assistance centers. But, what happens in contexts where we predict movement and borders close, or, it creates, like an anti-migrant rhetoric in those areas, then we really need to consider how the results are communicated. The model could be perfect, the practicality aspect could be great, but maybe then, okay, what we need to think about what happens if the results can feed into misinformation or disinformation campaigns. So it's like, we don't just see it like a data science project. It's like purely a technical discipline. It's not. There's an ethical discipline to it as well, but also when there's limited resources, there's a practical discipline. Like, is this actually going to change operations on the ground? And if it's not, without sounding too negative, then maybe we shouldn't do it. So that's so we really have to create kind of like the practical linkages, the linkages to the operations, which is just as a key aspect as getting the model right. And but the steps that we do kind of is our way. And we're not saying that this is the perfect roadmap, but this took us a year to develop with 120 different stakeholders, that it's probably a good way to think about some of the key steps. And if you get to the end, at least we're confident that maybe people or project teams has thought about the various different steps of a humanitarian data science project. And on that note, the reason why we did this is partly because of a lack, and I can't speak on behalf of other sectors, but in our sector there's a lack of digital standards. If you're engaging with not just AI, but it could be with developing, could be the discussion about biometrics, or it could be the application of kind of big data, or using drones, or drones less so, but it's the application or the lack of standards when it comes to digital applications. In the humanitarian sector, we have something called sphere standards, that if you're working in a displacement site and there's 100 people, you have to build one latrine for every 20 people. So if there's 100 people, you're going to build 5 latrines, but at the same time they have to be age sex disaggregated, so you're probably going to build 10 latrines. But there's real kind of tangible hardline standards that we all developed as a community, and we all endorse, and we all kind of self-regulate to. In the digital world, there's not really that, and so that or there's a lack of that. There's data protection guides, but there's individual data protection guides for individual organizations. So if you're a small NGO, or maybe if you're a AI team at a university looking to support an NGO, or maybe you're a private sector agency engaging in corporate social responsibility, whatever, you kind of like working independently on some of the key standards you have to implement. So that's kind of what we've tried to achieve with this tool, is just basically giving a bit of assurance that this is a technical aspect, and here are some of the key things we should consider. Is they're by no means standards, because who are we to develop the standards, but we're definitely, through experience from the operations on the technical side, we're like, hey, through the network of DSEG, these are some of the key things that we as a group think should be considered when building such an AI project. And this is just an example. And so when you complete the tool, you kind of get like a completion certificate, and that you can download, annex to projects, project proposals, but also a key thing. Where is it? Here we go. A key part of the tool as well was knowledge generation. So you can, when you sign up to the account and you go through the tool, you can say basically, you have to fill in a number of information, name. Here's just an example of myself. You can give a project profile update. So it could be a I don't know, risk. It could be a risk forecasting tool, based on sites that may be vulnerable, displacement sites that may be vulnerable to flooding. So it could be displacement sites overlaid with flood layers and climate data. So you give a description of the project, give a title, give some contact information. You can declare if you want to make it public, maybe you don't, but then basically you can go onto the resources tab of the website and learn more about projects. So if you're an organization thinking, I want to build a chatbot to communicate information about X, Y, or Z, then you can. The idea is to build this, and this is something we're working on. It's not fully operational yet, but this is the basically you can look for the type of projects that may be applicable to yours, and and explore that. Maybe it could. So the idea is to basically it's not just the kind of the decision tree process, but it's also building a repository of AI like-minded projects where people can also learn from each other as well. So that's kind of like a byproduct of the tool, and that's the part of the tool that we're kind of trying to focus and build at the moment, because the decision tree's been in place and it's been tested. But it's really kind of building that knowledge community regarding humanitarian AI projects. And I think we'll kind of leave it there now, and I'm not sure if people have questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But yeah, I'm not sure if people do have questions. I can see colleague Paige has a question.
Hi, Rob. Hi, Prithvi. Thanks very much for this presentation. I found it super interesting. So I had a couple of questions for you. And one is about application for people who are working more in the prevention, peace building space, and to what extent you think the tool can be used kind of out of the box. So I think you got into this a little bit actually toward the end, and really thinking about things like conflict sensitivity and how to communicate about some of the results that might be found, addressing bias, having a diverse representation. But I mean, it would be useful to maybe just pull out the threads of what you think is already there in the tool that's going to be relevant for people who are, working in very fragile settings with the same settings that you're working in, right? But slightly different objectives. So that was my first question. And then the second was just like a practical one about really understanding some of the uses that you've seen from the tool, and maybe like even example of a project that you think really benefited from it, that really made a difference to the project, that it took the tool into account. And I just was thinking about my own projects, how we probably could have benefited from using a tool like this. So thanks again. Yeah,
thank you, Paige, for the question. And maybe I'll have a first stab, and maybe Prithvi can answer. I mean, that was when we were first asked to present. This was something we kind of spoke with Branka about, and then we kind of went through, Prithvi and I, we kind of went through the tree, and in most aspects, the applicability is kind of like interdisciplinary, particularly on stages 3, 4, and 5, when you're talking about data and algorithms and communication. Like, you could be speaking in pretty much any sector. A colleague, one of the colleagues presented this the other day, I think at a fintech, and and so I would say the bits that are, how do you communicate the outputs of models in sensitive states? That's as applicable for humanitarian as it's someone working in conflict resolution. So the areas that we really kind of like humanitarianified the tree was really in the fundamentals. From a humanitarian perspective, these are the key things we need to know about. The do no harm approach is a key component of any humanitarian work, like whether it's an AI project or whether it's a food distribution. Like, if we're going to disrupt the status quo between displaced and host communities, we have to think about the do no harm. If we're going to develop an AI project to better give refugees on the move access to information about resettlement rights, we have to think about do no harm. Like, if we only provide the information in Arabic, does that create an overemphasis in Arabic but underrepresentative on Farsi speakers, for example? So I would say, yeah, it could be an out of box. it could be out. It could definitely be an out of box if peace or conflict resolution stakeholders are aware of what their own fundamentals are for that discipline. I would say, Prith, so I'm not sure if you have anything to add on that, and then I can maybe answer the use case as well.
I was just going to say that, what you say about like the context that you're working in and the sensitivity surrounding that, especially in very fragile contexts. I think, one thing that we need to kind of emphasize and we forget about sometimes, especially when there is such a drive towards, data and wanting to use very sophisticated forms of analysis and, AI and things, is that we have to recognize that somewhere, AI and its use is still very much in its like nascent stages. And regardless of whether you apply them to a fragile context or to a humanitarian context, even in daily life, in its current applications, it's raising so many ethical questions. So from that point of view, its further use in humanitarian or peace or anticipatory kind of context, it has to be underlined by that recognition. So being sensitive towards that and recognizing that, this may be very well the case that like AI and its use has to first go through so many hoops before we start applying it to already very vulnerable people, right? So that's something I think that like, I think personally, like we can't emphasize enough. But I mean, before Rob answers your use case question, I would say actually it would be really fascinating if you go through, even belatedly go through the tree yourself with the project that you have in mind and see, is there an alignment with the way in which the tree perhaps signposts certain questions for you or raises certain issues for you, and in relation to whether that actually worked out in the way that you did, because I'm guessing that you've completed this project, so you do know how it ended. But it would be good to even use as a resource and share with us, so that again it builds this like repository, and the more use cases that we have, the stronger the network gets, and the more we can kind of learn from each other.
And on the applications, so within the IOM's displacement tracker matrix team, we kind of have a data science and ethics team. So we have kind of people talking more about the ethics and the practical ability and some of the governance stuff, but we also have a kind of data science teams actually developing systems for our own operations. So the best example I can give is probably on that, where we DTM, we collect lots of information. We're a primary data collection team. Basically, we work in 72 countries collecting primary data on displaced people and mobile populations moving, say, through the Sahel region. A lot of the time we work in kind of data vacuums. So it could be the border of Sudan and South Sudan. It could be, super inaccessible areas or hard to reach areas of northern Ethiopia, or areas of kind of Sahel where Boko Haram are. So we basically we have an enumerator network of like 5,000 enumerators working in I couldn't even tell you the amount of languages. So we basically one of our projects is basically understanding kind of annual migration trends in West Africa. So, and we collect data points, we have hundreds of data points where we collect data on directions and flows of people. But what we also do in parallel to that is that we basically then forecast what the movement will be in a month and 2 months time. And then when we go out and collect the data, we basically create a secondary data point to know, so basically based on the last 6 months, we know that the trend is going up. So then we go out the next month, we collect it, and if it's going up, we're like, okay, we're on track. But if there's been a super big spike on up or a super drop, then we basically will be like, okay, that was unexpected based on what we've been seeing. Let's explore that further, but let's explore that further at ground level. So maybe it could be a flood that has stopped the movement of people, or maybe it's been a terrorist attack that has created an unexpected surge of displacement. But again, so we kind of run that through the tool, and coming back to the communication is that we're not overly comfortable with presenting kind of migrant trends at such a micro level, because all the information we collect is to inform operations. Hey, ANC code there, but so we produce actionable information, but with actionable information comes information that can be used inappropriately. So we decided by throwing a tree that we're not going to publish that data at that level, but what we'll publish is very kind of regional aggregates of movement. So so the data is kind of protected, if that makes sense. So then we kind of went for the tree, and that really come through actually at the communication stage. Like, how do we want to communicate the results of this process? Okay, we want to communicate it to the operational actors through kind of direct data sharing agreements, and we want to publish externally to the wide world at a much more aggregated regional level, where specific trends across certain routes are not clear and are kind of protected. So yeah, so that's kind of one of the probably best example I can give on that. A colleague in the chat asked, what is the purpose of the certificate? Do you review the data and algorithm used? Also, I would be interested in writing my master's thesis and something related to humanitarian analysis, agent-based modeling. So if there's any tips, contacts, yes, that's a great question. So the certificate was, we didn't have it in, and then we were actually asked to have it in by a donor, and that was basically because again, I can't speak about kind of the peace or conflict resolution sector, but in the humanitarian sector, there's been a very it's been like an explosion of popularity in AI enhanced projects. But there's like innovation funds and Google AI for Good grants and a number of grants. So basically, one of the donors come for us who were like, hey, can you, we're getting a ton of applications on AI in this and data science for that and whatnot, but we don't actually know, if they've considered, the responsible innovation aspects. So the certificate is really just a proof that a project team has thought about the 67 various steps that we as a community have identified as, if you're going to do a humanitarian project and you're going to consider the risks and the mitigations, this is somewhat of a document to show that you've kind of thought about them. In terms of, do we review the data and algorithm? No, we just provide guidance and links to areas where you can do more. And we even refer to OCHA's, which is the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, peer review project, where they will so you can dogleg out and actually go through their peer review process. So we're not like, if we were to check models, we kind of again, it comes on us if maybe the models are wrong, but so that's not our job. So we're collated sources. So our job is to basically, the way we call it is an innovation process, where we basically just direct people at various different steps to the best resources that we think are the resources for that particular step. So on the algorithm check, we direct you to Red Cross's 510 algorithm checker or the OCHA's peer review, and then the project team can then take it on their own to go as much down a rabbit hole in those aspects as they would like. In terms of the resources, go on to some of the data analysis slides, and again, there's tons of resources that you can go as much down a rabbit hole in different slides as you want. We don't have to say. We don't. Okay, someone's just saying we don't have the same explosion. Yeah, I wouldn't say there's been an explosion of funding, but I would say there's been an explosion on emphasis. And so humanitarian forecasting is probably the buzzword of the sector at the moment. Can we forecast this and forecast that and forecast this? Can we anticipate this, anticipate that? As a result of that, there's been an explosion of forecasting AI-based projects. There probably hasn't been the funding that correlates to the interest, but it means that donors are kind of being not overwhelmed, that's the wrong word, but are being there's significantly more AI enhanced projects now than I say was 5 years ago. So that's kind of why, you know, the certificate was just a, yeah, I've thought about the various different steps. It doesn't show the route, so it doesn't show that you've skipped yes or skipped no. It just shows, you know, that, hey, I thought about, our project team has thought about team diversity. You know, it's thought about, you know, recruitment of staff. It's thought about how to check data. It's thought about consent, how the data was collected. So that's kind of really what the certificate is about. Yeah, I hope I've answered that question. I'm not sure if I've answered, if there's any more questions. I think there's about 10 minutes left. So if anyone does have any more questions, we'll try our best to answer. In the meantime, as Prithvi mentioned, you know, it's an open group. We deliberately called it this corny tree name, decision tree name, because a tree has branches. So one thing we've been doing in the last couple of months is that now the tree is planted and it's growing, we're doing deep dives in particular areas such as in gender, in race, and in operational applicability. So there we're working with gender experts, or modeling team who are based in the operations of NGOs to really kind of do branching off of the tree to really do particular deep dives work, because that's kind of how we've been approached. So it's an open group. So if anyone online wants to do a particular, you know, has a particular area of their work that they think, you know, could benefit through engagement with the tree, please do give us an email. I'm gonna write our emails in the chat. And yeah, and if people want to kind of go, oh, you know, I work in this particular discipline, I really feel, you know, we could do a deep dive with DSEG and the decision tree in this aspect, then please get in contact with Prithvi and myself, and then we could set up a call and then, you know, see if we can develop, you know, 1 or 2 new branches to the tree. And that's why we basically called it a tree. But yeah.
And if I may just add to this, like, you know, one of a few areas in which that we're always, you know, open and welcome to expertise is also thinking about questions of accountability. How can we develop better and stronger accountability frameworks which can help inform the users of the decision tree? And if you do, you know, go through the decision tree and different sections of it, you will see that, you know, it is in many ways also every stage is like an invitation to the user to give feedback, to also tell us, you know, how can we improve things, what you think is missing. And you know, it's very much this you know, growing live document thing, and this is just kind of the start of how we want to start addressing some of these questions, but also very much recognizing that, you know, that there are like we, you know, I'm not the technical expert on the team, but then we do also have a technical expert. Like, how do we kind of draw on everyone's expertise to look at this process more, look at, you know, the use of AI and the use of and its applicability and ethics and so on from like a multidisciplinary perspective, rather than just, you know, a tech perspective, or rather only as an information management perspective alone, but like, what do these things actually mean and how do they impact people? And I think for us, maybe that's where the crux of like creating responsible, ethical and inclusive like AI technologies come about, you know. So yeah, please feel free to like get in touch with us if you think that something is incomplete, something can be developed further. If you're interested in, you know, if you're interested in the technical aspects, or if you're interested in improving accountability, be that, you know, in any sector, its applicability would very much be welcome. So yeah.
Okay, great. I've been monitoring the chat. There doesn't seem to be any more questions in the chat, so I think maybe we can close. But yeah, it's been a pleasure speaking to everyone today. I would like to thank Branka and the team for inviting us to speak. We're a little bit outside our wheelhouse, but yeah, we're a little bit outside our wheelhouse. But yeah, so apologies if we kind of emphasize the humanitarian aspect a bit too much. That's just the areas that Prithvi and I come from. But I hope that the tool, I hope there's a synergy to the peace sector. And yeah, we've shared our emails, and if people like to get in touch. And apart from that, I think if there's no more questions, we can probably close the meeting. It's been a pleasure speaking to you all from this evening.
Thank you. And if you're interested in a workshop, as I think someone mentioned, yeah, definitely get in touch with us and we'd be happy to organize. So thank you all.